So I read 106 books last year, and I just realized I never reviewed the last 9. So I want to do that. So it's a little late, but this is my December book roundup. We're going to give you short reviews and ratings for the books that I read in December. I'll also give you a little bit of a January TBR, although I guess it's not to be read, but something else because I've kind of read most of these. Anyway, here are the books I read in December. Sorry this is late, but I read some really good things. It wasn't the best month of the year, but there are some books that I definitely want to talk about that I read in December. If you like this video, of course, give me a like and subscribe. You know what to do. Hit the bell icon, all of that good stuff. Also, I have timestamps below in the description, so if you want to skip to a certain genre, you can go ahead and do that. I will group these by genre so you can skip wherever you need to in this video, but I will always save my book of the month to last, so that one will be the last one that you can hit through a timestamp. But let's go ahead and start with the fantasy genre, which of course dominated my reading. It seems to be that I'm just reading a lot of the fantasy genre right now because I'm just loving getting caught up with this genre. It's my favorite right now. So we're going to talk about the things that I read. The first one is something from my Kindle that I read, and it's called The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. Now, this is not a traditional fantasy tale, but it is fantastical, so it belongs in this genre. I really like the premise of this one. It is about a woman who is near death and is transported to this library where all of the books on the shelves are different versions of her life. If she made a different decision, she would take this book, and that book would be the book of her life. And she has some time in this library to explore these different life paths that she may have led. It's a concept that I love. I always love the idea of the road not taken. I always find just very thought-provoking the idea that someone's life can simply change if one little event is altered in the smallest way. I think this was done to its perfection by Kate Atkinson in her book Life After Life. So I love this concept. I love it in a historical context as well. If you think about how an historical event can change the trajectory of the entire history of the world. Hitler gets into art school as an example. So I always love this concept. So I was very intrigued by this book, very excited to read this book, and then was very disappointed. I just felt the execution was very lacking. It was so predictable, especially the ending. And even though it was a very short book, I think it's about 300 pages or so, I just couldn't wait to get to the end and get on to something better. So the execution was a bit of a disappointment. So in my 5-star rating system, I give it a 2.5 out of 5. I will say though, I think this would be a brilliant stage play. I could just picture it, she's in the middle with the librarian, and then when she opens a book, stage left, the new scene plays out of how her life could have been. But I just feel as a work of literature, it was just very lacking. So Midnight Library, not one of my favorites of the year. All right, into more fantasy, some more traditional fantasy, some classic fantasy. I finished a book series that I read as a youth, which was the Dragonlance Legends trilogy, with the third book, which is Test of the Twins. So in high school, this was my number 3 favorite fantasy series of all time. It was Lord of the Rings, Belgariad, Dragonlance Legends, and it's not that high anymore, but I did enjoy it. I thought the second book kind of was just kind of okay. It kind of meandered a little bit plot-wise, and the characters were not as strongly portrayed, at least as far as their motivations are concerned in that book. But I really enjoyed this. I think the Legends series is better than the Dragonlance Chronicles series. And although this isn't a top 3 for me anymore, I still enjoyed it. I gave Test of the Twins a 4 out of 5, and the series as a whole a 4 out of 5. If you're longing for some more traditional fantasy, I think these Dragonlance books are pretty solid. Again, that's what we got in the 80s. We didn't get a lot of the more modern voices that took fantasy into different directions. But even though I'm sure this review is a little bit nostalgia-fueled, I still did enjoy the ride. And there's enough world building in here that I'll read more in the Dragonlance world. I don't think it'll be anything this year, but maybe next year I'll pick up one of the other series that came out after Dragonlance Legends. But overall, I liked Test of the Twins. So the next series that I picked up is I read 2 books from the Witcher series. So I had read the the short story collections last year, and I enjoyed them a lot. I thought despite them being short stories, I'm not a huge fan of shorter fiction. I thought characterization was strong. There was enough glimpses of the world, and just the kinds of stories he was telling, I enjoyed them quite a bit. So I was disappointed when I picked up the first novel, Blood of Elves. My biggest motivation was to read this before Witcher Season 2 came out, which I did. I still haven't watched Witcher Season 2, so don't spoil it for me. But I was mostly disappointed in this one. It's even though it looks kind of thick, it's kind of a short novel because it has kind of some big text here, big font. But it was a bit disappointing to me. It has some great characters. Geralt of Rivia is fantastic. I love Ciri. In many ways, this was the beginning of kind of a coming-of-age tale for her. But I just found that the plot was kind of, all over the place. It was meandering a little bit and was just a bit disappointed in it. It didn't really go anywhere interesting to me. However, it was still good enough. I give it a 3 out of 5. It was still good enough for me to pick up the second book, A Time of Contempt, the second of the 6 Witcher novels. And I felt that this one started great. I thought it was just action-packed. It was very interesting. And I thought the ending was fantastic. I really loved where the story eventually went. But man, if the middle of this book wasn't a jumbled mess. I mean, there was just fuzzy everything, fuzzy world building, fuzzy political stories, fuzzy plot, like where is it going to go? And again, just disappointing to me. That said, I'm not a fan of Sapkowski's writing style. Now, I don't know if that's him or the translator, or even if it's the same translator for both stories, but I'm not a huge fan of just the way these stories are told. So both of these got the same rating for me, which is kind of my meh out of 5, 2.5 out of 5 for these. So kind of a disappointing start for my fantasy talk this month, but those 3 books that I've already mentioned just weren't very compelling to me. My average rating last year, I'll do a yearly wrap up at some point here, was 3.9. So, a trio of 2.5s is out of the ordinary for me. So I was pleased. The last fantasy book that I'm going to talk about is Red Country by Joe Abercrombie. Now, this is largely considered the bad Abercrombie book, at least based on the people I see talking about it, mostly on BookTube. And I see why. This really isn't a fantasy, it's a Western. And that didn't bother me because I'm not someone who just reads, fantasy or fantasy sci-fi. I read so many different genres, and I've come to like Westerns. Surprising to me, I didn't like them a lot as a youth, but I guess as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate them a little bit more. I haven't read a whole lot of Westerns, but I've enjoyed two books by Larry McMurtry, and then some of my favorite TV series are actually Westerns. I love Deadwood, fantastic. And then, of course, Firefly. It's a space Western, but it's still a Western. So I can see why a lot of fantasy readers didn't like Red Country, because it's more of a Western than a fantasy. It's, a wagon train and, a frontier town and a revenge story and the gold rush, and all of that's in there. I will say, though, that this is probably, of the 6 Abercrombie novels I've read, it probably does have, I don't want to say the weakest character work, but compared to just what he's done before, it kind of is. Abercrombie's character work, even when it's weak, is still better than 90% of authors out there, though. So it's not that it's weak. It's just in comparison to what he did in the First Law trilogy, what he did in Best Served Cold, I can see how a reader may not connect with the people in this book. But I did. I enjoyed the story. I thoroughly loved one of my favorite characters in the First Law story coming back in this one. And it's not totally unexpected. It's kind of alluded to on the back text, and you kind of see it coming. It's not Shivers, who seems to be in every book, but one of the characters from the First Law that was my favorite. It was fun to see his perhaps final chapter in this world. I don't know if he's in the Age of Madness trilogy or not, but it was fun to revisit that character. And I liked Red Country. I'm in the minority. 4 out of 5. All right, on to some historical fiction. So I have 3 works of historical friction. I say that a lot, historical friction. I have 3 works of historical fiction that I read last month, and they're all in the same series. And this is The Accursed Kings by Maurice Druyon. And I read, there's 7 books in the series. These are books 5, 6, 7. I read these initially because George R.R. Martin called this the original Game of Thrones. So immediately I was intrigued. And the political nature of these stories, which is centered around France before the 100 Years' War, certainly you can see where Martin got some of his influence. And I overall enjoyed the series quite a bit. The series as a whole, I gave a 4 out of 5. So very, very strong book series for me. The 5th book was The She-Wolf. And I felt initially this one was slow, but by the end it was very, very good. This was the longest book in the series, and the previous 4 books all had just kind of a faster pace. And even when it was jumping from character to character or setting to setting, it happened pretty quickly. And I just felt that this one, it kind of took its time, but not necessarily in a good way. But overall, I did enjoy it. Had a great, great ending to this one, and definitely had me compelled to pick up the 6th book immediately. So The She-Wolf, I gave a 3.5 out of 5. The Lily and the Lion is the 6th book in the series, and frankly, could have been the last book in the series. And in many ways, I wish it was, and you'll see that when I talk about the last one. But The Lily and the Lion is all of the events that we've been building in these 6 books that leads to the start of the 100 Years' War. And it follows most notably Robert of Artois. I hope I'm saying that correctly, but it follows his story all the way to the end of his life. And there's a very cool afterword by Druyon where he just writes a little bit of a lament, how he's sad that because Robert dies, as all historical figures do, he's sad that he can't write about him anymore. And I found his story very compelling. He was kind of a minor character in the previous books, but he was the main character in The Lily and the Lion. And this one was very compelling. I enjoyed this one quite a bit. I gave this one a 4 out of 5. The 7th book was very disappointing. The King Without a Kingdom. First of all, The Lily and the Lion actually could have ended the series because in addition to just getting to the 100 Years' War, he kind of has like an epilogue where he wraps up all of the loose ends of the story, at least all the main ones that matter to you as a reader. The King Without a Kingdom, man, I don't know what he was thinking with this book. First of all, he broke the cardinal rule of a writer in that he told instead of showed. Show, not tell is the big cliche, and unless it's executed perfectly, you should show and not tell. And this was not executed perfectly. We get a character who we haven't met, who it's a first-person narrative the entire book. And this character is, in my mind, more of a caricature than a character. And he tells the story of the events of everything that happens in here. And nothing is as compelling as anything else in the previous 6 books that we've read. Additionally, he does a retelling of the Battle of Poitiers. And again, I hope I'm saying it correctly. But having earlier this year, I read 1356 by Bernard Cornwell. And he does a retelling of this battle and does such a masterful retelling that Druyon's just pales by comparison. So it's a book series that I enjoyed quite a bit. I recommend reading the first 6 and skipping this one because the first 6 I think are great. And then this one limps to the finish. This was my lowest rated book of the month, I think. 2 out of 5, King Without a Kingdom. Yeah, it is. It's probably one of my lowest rated books of the year, not counting the DNFs that I don't rate. All right, on to my last category, and that is biography. And this is Pops, A Life of Louis Armstrong by Terry Teachout. This is my book of the month, and this is one of the finest biographies that I have read. I love it when an author is able to write in such a colorful manner that it's so compelling and fun to read. So many biographies I've read are just so dry and just fact upon fact. And when you get a skilled author like Teachout that just brings these events to life and just gives them such vibrancy. It's such a joy to read. And Lewis's life was very interesting, from his very humble beginnings to one of the most celebrated jazz musicians ever, to kind of a pop idol. And he also talks about how that made him kind of a controversial figure in the jazz world late in his life. He also talks about how Lewis became so popular he was able to positively affect race relations. And I just loved this book. I just had such a good time reading it. I think even if you're not, I'm a musician and a big fan of jazz, and even if you're not of that, I think if you love a great biography, I think you'll really enjoy Pops, A Life of Louis Armstrong by Terry Teachout, my book of the month in December. All right, so on to my January TBR, although the three I'm going to show you, I'm kind of done with a couple. But anyway, this is what you can look forward to me talking about pretty soon. Since we're almost in February, pretty soon you'll see my January book roundup and my February TBR. But you can look for some reviews for these three selections. Sharp Ends by Joe Abercrombie. This is a short story collection set in the world of the First Law. So again, just some more Joe. I figure it's a great way to start my year is to read some Joe Abercrombie. The next thing, the book series that I'm going to read, and I'm partway through, you can tell by the bookmark, is I'm going to reread a book series from my youth called The Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. And this was the first fantasy book series I read all the way back in 6th grade. The first time I ever picked up a fantasy book, it was this series. So I'm going to read today, because these are short, I'll read this one today, The Castle of Lear, which is the third book in the series, but I'll have finished all 5 by the end of the month, and we'll do a review of these in my January book roundup very soon. And the last one that I will be talking about that I'll read this month is James Clavell's Shogun, which is an epic length work of historical fiction. And having finished this, my goodness, this is a great book. I cannot wait to talk about it with you. So that is a little bit of my TBR for January. Sorry this is so late. I almost skipped it, but then I said I read 106 books. I want to have a video, just a little short review for every one of the books that I read in 2021. But I'm looking forward to reading more great things in 2022. And I appreciate any of you that enjoy these reviews. Let me know if you've read any of these, if you agree or disagree with me, like Red Country, or just let me know what you read last month. And I'm looking forward to putting out more videos this year. As always, like and subscribe if you haven't already. Follow me on Twitter and Goodreads for more content. Thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.